So welcome back, audience members, for our all-panel roundtable. So I hope you enjoyed everything so far. So I'm going to pitch a few questions to the group here, which people can answer at their leisure, and then we will open things up to the audience. So my first question is about periodization. This is something that scholars are notorious for caring more about than ordinary people. Coming up with terms like the long 19th century and all the rest. Okay, I'm guilty of this too. So my question though is 1820 is almost the exact midpoint between the American Revolution and the outbreak of Civil War. Two much more read and written about periods of history and dramatic change. And so my question is to you that would you say in terms of your research, would the folks that you have studied, residents of 1820, if you will, right, in terms of their lived experience or how they thought about their place in the world, do you think they would have felt more at home in 1776 or in 1861? All right, and so put another way, does 1820 have more in common with the American Revolutionary era or with the sort of era of the right before the American Civil War? And I will let you take a stab at it. Whoever wishes to go. Sharon, I see a hand up. Go for it. Unmute yourself and let's hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I think it depends on where you live. I think there are places where things have already radically started changing in ways to make it more like the late antebellum period, and other places that are on the frontier, that are just starting out, that are much more like the early republic, the earliest years of the republic. So I think that's really depends on where you are and who you are, how you're going to experience that. But I like how you pointed out that 1820 is a midpoint, because it really is. And to this question of periodization, I think a lot of it, we're in a period right now where people are talking about the before and after the pandemic and how life will never be the same again. And there are certain moments like the American Revolution, like the Civil War, where you can say that those periods matter, even though there are continuities. And so I think it's a good question, is something like the changes around 1819, 1820, which a lot of things are going on, whether that counts as enough of a turning point.
Okay. I see Matt as well.
Yeah, that was a great point by Sharon. I just wanted to build on that. In terms of people's cultural consciousness, I think they felt very tied to living in this era when some of the founding fathers were still alive. I mean, you could get a letter from Thomas Jefferson if you're John Holmes, and then he dies not that much longer. There's this cultural sense of reverence for the fathers, but also kind of like in the late 20th century was it Peter Brokaw running around talking about the greatest generation and they're dying off. That sense of being tied to as the ultimate cultural touchstone, that revolutionary generation, and we still have them amongst us. And then Lafayette tours the United States in the 1820s, and that brings up that sense of cultural connection to the sainted fathers. So there's this sense culturally of living very much in the shadow of and being very tied to that revolutionary generation, and this sense that they're dying off, and how are we doing to preserve their legacy. So I think they felt more comfortable in aspiring to be like the generation from the late 18th century.
Okay. Thank you. Ashley Rattner, yes.
I'm going to take a slightly more pedagogical approach in answering, but I think it's really valuable to put 1820 more in the category of 1861 because, full disclosure, I'm a literary scholar, so maybe this bears out in history, maybe not. But I find it's much easier for students to conceptualize the chaos and the, again, uneven landscape of the time. Obviously, that was true in 1776 as well. But if we're using the Civil War as like this either beginning or end of a survey course, I I think it's much more prevalent in that idea. So by comparing these two things, we're able to emphasize this element of, to go back to Sharon's earlier point, it really depends on where you live. It really depends on like so many other factors that can be highlighted by categorizing it in this way.
A very good point. Yes. Okay. So then, let me pull up my other questions. So thanks for that. So I'm wondering, and so clearly the past is not a cookbook with recipes for advice for the present, right? Nor does it repeat. But that said, considering life in 2020, 2 centuries after Maine statehood, what aspect of life circa 1820 that you study do you think would be the most useful for audience members to consider as relates to their own lives in 2020 in terms of, you know, what in your experience? Yeah, so I'm going to leave it there. I see a lot of hands there.
Yeah, to me, one thing that has struck me in recent years is that we're almost getting to how politically divided people were in the early republic, how partisan everything was. One thing that has struck me by the politicization of things like face masks and doctors in the midst of this pandemic is it is back to the future in terms of the early republic. Maine certainly saw this. I tried to depict Mainers in my talk as deeply divided over a whole range of issues, including slavery. But to me, the most important touchstone is the yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia in the 1790s, in which there was a Federalist diagnosis and a Democratic Republican diagnosis, and a Federalist cure and a Democratic Republican cure. There were some places even had partisan graveyards. So the degree to which everything becomes partisan, including wearing a face mask, seems to me to be we're on the road back to the political milieu of Maine in 1820, or the early republic in general.
I'll just do one shout out to a great book people might want to read by Andrew Wehrman that's coming out called Contagion of Liberty, talking about disease and sort of political rhetoric in the early in the Revolutionary era. So Ashley, you also you had a hand up. So what have you got for us?
Well, he's 60% stole my thunder, but one thing I can add is, I don't know, there's a point in views in which Fanny Wright is really explicit about, and I think anyone at this time would recognize how partisan newspapers are, which, yes, we're there again, like we are able to recognize that, but I think it'd be useful to kind of have that sense of critically examining it. Again, not necessarily saying that everybody in 1820 was a great critical reader and they're like, there's the bias in this. But still, just that awareness and to kind of like put yourself outside of that partisanship and who benefits from politicizing masks? Like, what is behind this? What is driving this? I would like that to exist in this world.
Thank you. Sharon, yes.
I want to piggyback on both of them, but in the sense of being the eternal optimist, when I look back and see the partisanship and see the divisions and see the chaos and see some of the crazy stuff that went down in the early republic, I kind of go back to Martin Luther King Jr. with the arc of history bends towards justice. We did survive all of those crazy episodes. We've survived some pretty horrendous moments in history. And so looking back at that partisanship, we survived then. So hopefully we can also survive now. So that's the lesson I'd like to, and when I bring it up in class, you know, I with students pointing to some of the crazy partisanship that went down in the backstabbing and the attacks and the, you know, really nastiness, just as a reminder that we've been there before. And so it's democracy can hopefully survive. So
Thank you. And I'm going to give it to Matt, and maybe if he can address this. This seems relevant to building on what everybody says. But so one of the terms that get thrown around to describe the late teens and into 1820 was the era of good feelings, right? To describe, right, the defeat of the Federalist Party utterly, right, and the smooth sailing, unopposed presidency of James Monroe. Was this a sarcastic term that maybe curdled into something that people thought was real? Or was this a real term used by some people trying to claim there was an era of good feelings? And if Matt, you want to take that on the way to saying whatever else you were going to say.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to add to Sharon's comment. Not only did they survive the partisanship of they survived worse than what we've got. I mean, in terms of the optimist glass half full, or glass empty, whenever I hear people talk, things have never been worse in America. You know, there was a civil war, for crying out loud, right? I mean, so they stop with the things have never been more divided in America. So they survived worse than we currently, for now, are experiencing. As for the term era of good feelings, I would say it was a hopeful term that then curdled into a sarcastic term. It was, it expressed the hopes of Federalists in the aftermath of the War of 1812 that they could be rehabilitated. Because during the war, they had opposed the war vigorously in an organized fashion with the movement that led to the Hartford Convention, and there was talk of secession and sitting this war out, neutrality, a range of options that looked more than vaguely treasonous to Democratic Republicans who were waging that war. And in the aftermath of that, as the Federalist Party on a national level seems to be sinking into insignificance, there's this hope by many Federalists that they could be rehabilitated amidst a period of nonpartisan quiescence, and they would seem less threatening, and James Monroe might bring them into some important partisan positions and so forth. But what ended up, and you see this, of course, during the Missouri crisis, yes, you kind of have one party, but what that means is party chaos. And Democratic Republicans squabbling between themselves without any kind of sense of a common enemy in the form of the Federalists at the national level. At the local level, there are still some important Federalist districts in, say, Massachusetts and so forth. But that sense of party chaos and the sense of being betrayed by your former party brethren led to an increase in the kind of heatedness of political toxicity of political rhetoric, to use a more contemporary term, in this supposed era of good feelings. And so the divisions and recriminations of the Maine and Missouri crisis are actually reveal what's really going on in the era of good feelings much better than that hopeful term does, at least in my reading.
Thank you. All right. So I think, Stephen, your hand is raised, and if you wish to speak, do so. Otherwise, I have a question for you anyway, so.
Okay. I'll speak just quickly. I mean, that what Professor Mason was talking about sort of made me think about what, was it Francis Fukuyama, when the Berlin Wall came down and the end of that era. And it was like he said, this is the end of history. And in a way, that's like the era of good feelings. It's because history was bad because parties were, of course, not part of the founding fathers' vision. There wasn't supposed to be anything like parties. And when they emerged, it was like, that was like the Cold War. That was wrong and dangerous. And so the era of good feelings was almost for them a way of saying, things maybe have become normal again, ideally. That's all.
Excellent, thank you. So I'm going to ask you folks to go down the line, and we'll start with Ashley, and we'll work our way. And so, having listened to these other speakers today, how has listening to these other talks of circa 1820 perhaps changed or just influenced or shaped how you think about your own work now? In terms of, so for Fanny Wright and these reformers, hearing about some of these other things going on, does that color now how you might interpret this scholarship with the utopians going forward, Ashley, for example?
Yeah, so I think that in my own work, I don't typically situate everything as much within the political landscape as I should. And I think that's certainly on all of the players' minds, like as somebody is authoring a book of travel writing, like Wright intends this to be interpreted in a certain way, and then her readers will take it in a politicized way as well. So it's not something you can just like cut off and say, oh, I'm not interested in politics that much. Walking away from this, I am going to really just like bolster that background, I think, because it was so critical to everyone alive at the time that you can't separate one thing from that.
Yeah, Stephen, we'll go with you. We'll go in the order of the panelists.
Oh, yeah, okay. I think that one of the most useful things that I've been getting out of today is, and this gets back to the question of dividing lines and periodization in American history, because I did much of my early work about social and cultural reform, temperance, sex, abolitionism. You can go on. I have always used 1830, knowing, of course, that things don't ever change. Like in 1 year, oh, it's 1830. I may as well become more extremist. But 1830 was the point that I've always tended to use just as shorthand to sort of say something really deep changed in the culture. You have Garrison starting the Liberator. You have the radicalization of the anti-slavery movement, the radicalization of the temperance movement, and so on. I now have to realize that my shorthand, which I always knew is, I've always known as false, that this confirms that for me. I mean, that it's clear that changes like that don't come out of nowhere. They don't start in 1830. And that what we've heard today about, for instance, 1820 in various ways, but especially the Maine Missouri Compromise, makes it clear that this kind of intense feeling about something is wrong that we heard, you know, that thing really emerged earlier. It's just that it reached, for me, still some kind of a coalescing point around 1830. But yeah, so this sends me back to before 1830.
Thank you. Great. Sharon, would you care to?
Sure. I think I really liked how when Matt was talking about the what was the rank of slavery within the list of different Northern values, and thinking about it along those terms, I think that's very helpful. And I think that is applicable not only to slavery, where it is directly relevant, but to a host of other issues. You know, I always argue that people present the banking issue as you're either pro-bank or anti-bank, especially Bank of the US in this period, and that's absolutely untrue, that there's a wide range of kind of reactions to the bank, but I think thinking along the lines of, well, how important was it to them also is relevant, and where did that rank in their list of issues that they were dealing with. So I think it's very useful for my work on slavery, but also for my work on banking more generally. And so I really like that framing of the idea.
Thanks very much. Matt.
Well, thank you for that, Sharon, but I have to, again, give credit to David Potter for that formulation.
Sorry, thank you, David Potter.
Yes, thank you. Hand over your heart for David Potter. Yeah, I just want to echo some of the things that people have been talking about in relation to what Ashley was saying about travel literature. Is that cultural or political history? Yeah. In many ways, the way Stephen was talking about cultural, social, economic, political history, kind of one big gumbo in early American history, probably throughout human history. But I find it very useful to try to kind of separate separate those. And when you think about travel literature in particular, in many ways, it underscores what I was saying earlier. When Fanny Wright is talking about what she observes about American slavery, or the with so many other travel writers, how terrible the taverns were that they had to stay in, and just the accommodations are rubbish in early America, and so all these British commentators, is that what they're really talking about, or are they really ultimately reflecting on the political system, republicanism versus monarchy? If I had to boil it down, I would say that's the ultimate point, that's the axe that people are grinding in a lot of this travel literature, which is essentially a political point. But fortunately, we don't have to choose just one issue that they're addressing. It is this kind of gumbo of multiple things that we as historians want to kind of separate out. I'm an economic historian or a political historian. So in short, I just want to echo, if you think about the papers in general, and yeah, amen.
Thanks. And I will, I'll say, so we unfortunately, we don't have James here with us at the moment, I believe for technical reasons. I certainly will not speak for him as a scholar of more the early modern period, but definitely does plenty of work on the US as well, often on Indigenous issues. I'll say, building on James Francis' contributions, you know, certainly we keep being continually reminded, the more we look at the history, also how central Indigenous history is to the story of the United States, well beyond the sort of, you know, colonizing era. And so thinking about, right, the bank connections that Sharon's talking about, this is all in land speculation, right, out appropriating Indian country and sponsoring the U.S. You know, the U.S. government is spending most of its money on internal improvements on this land, and then on military to conquer and police it, right? And even I was, when commenting at another historical event last month, I was at least celebrating the Homestead Act as, or sorry, not the Homestead Act, the land grant, the Land College Act, as somehow separate from and not involving the direct pillage of Indigenous land. And I was corrected by a different historian who said, no, they all went together. So even the higher ed you love so much, Ian, is also associated with this massive imperial spread to the westward on the part of the U.S. government. And so we can see how that's kind of, these different topics are bleeding into each other. Stephen, yes.
Yeah. You moved me to realize that I do not share altogether the optimism that Sharon especially was suggesting, and that after all, we did survive, but who is the we? I mean, there was the Civil War, and then there was Reconstruction, and then there was the sellout in 1878, although obviously that welled up from earlier. My own sense is one of fear that something like that is going to happen today with the movement to, say, end systemic racism. I fear that it'll be taken over by the corporations, appropriated just the way the symbols of hippiness and peace movement were taken over in the 70s.
Thanks very much. Sharon, and then we have a audience question that actually will build on this last remark there. Sharon,
yeah,
please.
I was just going to go off of Stephen's point and say, you're absolutely right. And of course, how many people died during the Civil War as a result of these fights? So there's been a lot during so many other eras. So you're absolutely right. There's a lot lost and a lot of pain and a lot of that gets has been sacrificed in all of this, from Native Americans to African Americans to people who fought and died, civilians and military. So you're right. That's absolutely true. So the optimism is more 50,000 mile view from the top, less of the on the ground reality of how you get there.
I just fear that the we who have always survived is always the same people.
Yeah.
And that it doesn't include anything like everybody.
This is a good point, and brings certainly those of us who teach the introduction to American history right? You know, I think we often talk about in the class, who's the we talk about in our national history. And when we really mean our as in everybody, how does that change the narrative, right? And is it possible to have a single narrative? And if so, what does it look like? So we have a question from Jane Gordon asking, as scholars who've looked at Maine and the nation in 1820, given what you've shared with us today, what one question do you hope future scholars ask about Maine and the nation in 2020? Putting on your educated commentator hat, what is it about life today that you hope later generations inquire into and pay attention to? Matt.
I would hope that people would capture the degree to which America is divided better than sometimes historians do. And what I mean by that is sometimes we use big labels to describe, say, the age of Jackson. And talk about how Jackson represented the common man and the consensus. There's times in which it verges almost onto the sense that he with Indian removal or anti-abolitionism or breaking up the US Bank represented some kind of consensus position. And if I was a Whig and knew that future historians were going to describe me as living in the age of Jackson and somehow complicit in the crimes of that Andrew Jackson, I would be horrified. You know, and I would hope that they pay attention to the degree to which people vigorously opposed the policies of someone like Andrew Jackson. And so I would hope that, you know, surely the 75 years that have elapsed since 2016 will go down as the age of Trump. But if that is in any way communicating anything other than political division and pushback against the agenda that is carried forward in Washington, we would be disappointed if we're not pro-Trump. So I would hope people would do better than sometimes we do with our broad labels for whole eras that sometimes redact the true political divisions of their era.
Thank you. That reminds me, just talking about people who talk about the phenomenon of the so-called culture wars as being new. I always wonder, like, where were you? The election of what, 1824 or 1828, the Jackson campaign says, vote for Jackson who can fight, not Adams who can write. And like, if that's not a culture clash, I don't know what is. And so the idea that these are somehow Americans decided to be culturally clashing, you know, between different virtues and sections, it's silly. But so anybody else wish to put on their scholarly hat for the sake of posterity before we move on to a different question? Okay. So then I have another question for you guys. So I should add, it's interesting you guys bring up a lot of political considerations because when we were crafting this conference, the hope was that the plan was this was going to be a little bit of everything. And certainly the Missouri Maine crisis happened, and that's a great sort of coat hook to hang things on, right? But there's all this other stuff going on, and there was initially hopes for talk of whaling and all the rest, and a bunch of you were all invited to talk about different aspects of culture. And yet, the vast majority of our speakers kept coming back to issues that the audience thinks of through this political lens, as do you, right? And so for those of you who then didn't come here to speak about avowedly political things per se, right? So what would you, I suppose, how should we take that in terms of, what would you have to say to audience in terms of challenging what we consider to be the boundaries of political history? And when we talk about American, in particular, and the US nation, American political history in this time, what would you have to say about maybe how people might consider rethinking what they consider to be high political issues based on what you work on? No, I do not have. Clearly that was a whiff. I'm sorry. Okay. Okay. So different tack, something that this conference did not discuss directly, although a few of you alluded to it, was religion. But so this is something that a lot of audience members just might not know very much about the practice of religion circa 1820 for the majority of Americans. And so in what way do you think that, would you say that religious practice and belief influenced this issue you were talking about today, that people living today wouldn't necessarily expect? In what ways did maybe religion surprisingly influence how people thought about finance, or about reform, or about public health, or civic participation, that would be perhaps surprising to a modern audience? Ashley, yes.
I think the anti-religious comments that Fanny Wright made really like poisoned the well against her, right? That she called out systemic oppression. She called out the institution of marriage and its connection to the church, and people couldn't get beyond that. Immediately, if she would come and give a lecture at the lecture hall in your city, people would go just to hiss at her. So you couldn't hear her talk because everyone's hissing. So yeah, I think that's an element. Again, like, everything's nuanced. Who knew?
Yeah.
Not a great original contribution. But still, to see what we're overlooking when we have some pigeonhole, oh, all of the Calvinists are like this. Oh, free thought is anti-God, or whatever broad stroke dismissal is at play. Lost my train of thought.
Right, it's okay. Thank you. Trains were new in 1822, so it's perfect. Yes, excellent. Okay, yes, Sharon.
So I don't have a really good answer for you, but the assumption that a lot of people have made about finance is that it had to conflict with religion, and particularly from my work on life insurance, that there was a prominent scholar who argued that the reason life insurance developed when it did or was stymied originally was because people were against it for religious practices, which I vehemently disagree with. I find no evidence of that. That's a later reading in. But the one area where religion does touch in, even if it's not an active per se, is through usury laws, are always portrayed as you know, they you can trace them to the Bible, and that's where these ideas come from. And even as they become completely secularized, not completely, but they become secularized by this point, it's still a very kind of a remnant of religion that remains in this period. But you certainly have you know, interesting intersections, and there's been some interesting work done by a number of young scholars on this intersection between religion and the market and developments in this time period. And so it's certainly an interesting topic, but that wasn't the most enlightening answer.
Oh, thank you very much. And certainly, to get back, if you want to, Ashley, if you could actually give us a brief perspective, I know from your other work, you also are a scholar of many of these utopian reforming communities. And admittedly, few, if any, were in Maine, although there is a Shaker community still in Maine. Was there any connection of some of these utopian reformers to circa 1820 that you think might most surprise or be relevant to our audience today?
My disclaimer is that I am so mired in about 4 communities that, yes, there were certainly far, far more than that. There were hundreds in the 19th century. I'm sure there were some in 1820. I can't enumerate them off the top of my head, But just as a general takeaway point, what surprised me when I started this project was how many contemporaries looked at something like a Shaker village as a viable option for either a period of your life or the remainder of your life. I think looking back, we see these communities and like Brook Farm, like they seem ill-fated. They seem as though they're destined to fail because we know they fail in empirical ways according to how we define success. But when you're reading newspapers, like utopian is not an insult. That means it's impossible. If your husband died and you have all these young kids, it's very common to say, hey, I can't take care of this household right now. I am going to join the Shakers until I can get on my feet again. So I think just kind of how widespread this is and how much a part of the fabric of culture. Obviously, it's a rejection of a mainstream culture, so it's not just, oh, what a rich tapestry. But still, to take into consideration that hundreds of these communities popped up and many people lived in one for a while or knew somebody who did, I think certainly complicates our understanding of the 19th century and 1820 as a year within that.
Also, I think that's now my new favorite. That's like, seems like just the best sort of online deflation line of just like, this failed by all the metrics of objective failure. Like there's no, of all the objective metrics of success, your community failed. So that just, I'm gonna remember that. Matt, is that a hand up?
Yeah.
Okay.
That is. It was a really interesting question to think about what is surprising about religion in this thing that I was talking about. And your last question wasn't bad. I just felt like I couldn't talk about it as the straight up political historian. So anyway,
that's right. Yeah.
This would be, I think, surprising when I'm going to posit for the kind of Maine and Missouri crisis era politics. It would be surprising to people who are more familiar with a later period like the Jacksonian era, because the kind of default in the cultural politics of the Jacksonian era that you were talking about tended to be Whigs pushing their reform agenda on temperance or whatever, and Democrats' default position, with plenty of exceptions, being leave your religion at home, people. This is politics, right? That kind of cultural politics. I don't see that in the debates that I'm looking at, that I looked at from, say, 1819 to 1821. Yes, religious rhetoric could ratchet up the heat whenever you compare some doughface to Judas. That's not going to go down especially well. But there's not a sense from the doughfaces of, you know what, leave your religious piety with your anti-slavery position behind, and that we're not talking about that right now. They tended to try to fight fire with fire. So it wasn't an essentially political or religious debate, but neither side kind of eschewed religious rhetoric in politics in the way that the Jacksonians would tend to do in later periods. And I think I haven't thought much about the implications for that, but I think that is something that might surprise people who know a later period better.
Thank you. So I'm gonna switch to a different question, a different theme than religion, and another unaddressed one, and that would be science. Not, of course, always at war with religion, but something that I think a number of these talks could speak to, but we're not explicitly about, right? And so, of course, for our purposes in literature and history, right, science is whatever people at the time believe it is. So that's fine. And so according to what people believed it was at the time, so what role was science shaping how these people you were looking at thought about, you know, reforms, finance, race, you know, all these kinds of things that, again, that perhaps that this audience might be surprised by. What were some roles of science you could have brought in that you maybe did? Sharon, yes.
Actually, before I answer that, I was going to go back to your political question, since I didn't feel like any of us really answered that. but I would say for specifically for banks, banking was implicitly a political process because banks had to be chartered. And those bank charters, especially in this early period, were all individually crafted. I've just been going through hundreds of Southern bank charters, and even though they're cookie cutter, they're all tweaked, and they're all slightly different. And those slight differences come down to different political considerations and political lobbying and trying to get different advantages and disadvantages. And so what's going on in the financial system is so closely linked to what's going on in the politics in different areas. And even as I said, the question of banks behaving badly, and when there were problems, it came down to political considerations of how you respond to that. So the politics is in some ways embedded in the system even more firmly in the economic system, financial system, than other later periods. But to your question about science, I actually am going to jump back to life insurance because in this period, the life insurers need to convince people that they are using models of prediction based on, what premium am I going to charge you? What is the likelihood of death? Are they predicting putting together mortality tables and putting together premium tables that make sense? And they're constantly saying, this is scientific. We're using scientific models, and this is what they're presenting to the public. And this is a really important time period for numeracy and for belief in the importance of scientific method. They're saying that publicly. Privately, they're saying we have no idea what the hell we're doing. But they publicly, as they're trying to sell these policies, are very much aware of trying to present it as something that's scientifically based and selling that to the public.
Thank you. Great. I see, Stephen, your hand is up.
I'm not sure that it should be, but it seems to me that we have to see the notion of science itself as being in flux. That science was only in the early stages of becoming professionalized, at this time. I mean, all of us can think of different examples. By the end of the century, with the kind of positivism that sort of wins, then that science becomes a clearly formulated, an answer. In a way, science gives the answers the way the Bible used to give the answers culturally. But that at this time, I wrote my dissertation primarily about a health reformer named Sylvester Graham. And his major book was called The Science of Human Life. So it was sort of like everybody was, and what he was talking about was giving up alcohol, meat, tea, coffee, tobacco, and sex. And that was a scientific analysis. People were just grabbing onto it. And I don't think that that's all I would really have to say. I mean, that science itself is not a category that's stable any more than religion is, for that matter.
Matt, if I may ask you, and I'm sure you have things to add as well, but in case you weren't going to, I think the rise in certain race science seems relevant as well, and that some audience members may not be as familiar with that, perhaps as here. And so would you perhaps speak to that and how that was shaping these debates over slavery and statehood, besides whatever else you might have said?
Yeah, the thing that I would emphasize about race pseudoscience is exactly what Stephen was just saying. It was very formative. People are not running around measuring heads like they would even just a couple decades later to measure the size of your cranium, and that be the way pseudoscience, way to establish intellectual superiority for a whole race. All of that is formative or not quite yet heard of, and so things are kind of up for grabs in terms of racial science in the early decades of the 19th century. And so I don't see them playing a whole big role in these debates. But one kind of social science-y thing that played a fascinating role in the debate over extending slavery to Missouri. And it was hinted at in one of the editorials I was talking about with Francis Douglas's editorials, defending the idea that you're actually making slaves' lives better by allowing them to go west. And this was the position known as diffusionism. And it was kind of based on kind of Malthusian kind of social science, the idea that if you keep slaves penned up in the eastern states, they will suffer a much higher mortality rate because of the density of the population. They, of course, will then be more likely to revolt and be a threat to their masters based on the density of the enslaved population. But the kind of pseudoscientific kind of thing, the social science-y kind of argument that many anti-restrictionists made during the Missouri crisis debates was that you will benefit the lives of African Americans by allowing them to be trafficked to these new states. And of course, the restrictionist response to that went a little something like, what? That makes no sense whatsoever. So there's a contestation of, even from a mortality rate kind of point of view, but then of course the morality of, okay, the way to solve the slavery is to spread it everywhere. That's crazy talk. But they were trying to base it on some sort of social science-y kind of thing with the diffusionist argument. And many people, including Thomas Jefferson, especially in the Upper South, really embraced that version of scientific kind of argument.
Interesting. And not to keep on it too long, but I guess I was under the perhaps misinformed idea that the general argument from scholars of this issue had been that, if for the recap, would be that the 18th century, the Enlightenment era, had a much greater emphasis on sort of environment and sort of human ability to change and improve, whereas to sort of crude generalization among many white American science and European scientists was a rise in sort of biological racism, emphasizing the sort of inherent, difference and in human, sometimes even species in this case, but that the language of sort of non-white inferiority, these sort of biological racists increasingly deployed a language of science, whereas perhaps in the 1760s and 70s, they might not have done that. But perhaps I'm wrong, and I'm not a specialist in that.
You're not at all wrong in the broad brush, right? But in many ways, it goes back to your original question for this panel. Would these folks have felt more comfortable with 18th century style environmental thinking or 19th century style kind of inherent characteristics kind of thinking? They're right on that kind of free-flowing border of, everything seems to be up for grabs in the ways that Stephen was talking about, especially when it comes to kind of race pseudoscience. It was kind of the Wild West in terms of you could go either direction, and many people did.
Okay, thank you. So switching gears yet again, going from science to another theme that was touched on by a number of these presentations, but not the central focus for the most part, and that would be region. Maine is in New England. Dare we say it's even the best half of New England even, right? Space-wise, right? And so I'm wondering if we focus on Maine if possible, but definitely New England. Some of these developments you're talking about, right? In terms of finance, right? In terms of sort of this public, commemoration of holidays like Christmas. Is there a specific regional side to this story, right? Like a regional character of reform, for example, or a regional character to changes in finance, or I suppose, or Christmas? Yes, Sharon.
If no one else is throwing up their hands. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially because everything was done state chartered for the banks. Every state had a different flair, but those tended to be regionally concentrated. So the Northeast, a lot of small individual unit banks. A lot of, going back to Naomi Lamoureux's work, insiders who were the stockholders just so they can get loans for themselves, which is very different from what we see in Southern banks and in Western banks and in Mid-Atlantic banks. which Southern banks tended to have large banks that were often state-owned or partly or fully state-owned, with large numbers of branches across the states, looking much more like the Bank of the U.S. For the state than anything we see in the Northeast. And so there's definitely state-by-state differences, but also regional differences that need to be taken into account. And people have often dismissed Southern banking as being behind because they had so many fewer banks, not taking into account that their banks were so much bigger and more highly capitalized. And so there's a lot more variation that needs to be taken into account, but this regional question is very important for finance.
Thanks very much. Anybody else, a specific New Englanditude, if you will, about either reform or, for that matter, changes in Christmas? Yes, Ashley.
I don't want to answer the question, but can I pose another one to Sharon?
Yes, yes.
How much of that do you think is tied to population?
You mean in terms of how they were doing their banking system?
Yeah, because I feel like New England is much more populous than a lot of these other regions that you're comparing it to at the time. Like, is there a clear correlation or not really?
No, there is. I mean, absolutely. There. If you look at capitalization on a per capita basis, then you'll see that for a time Mississippi was actually one of the most highly capitalized banking areas, and Louisiana was highly capitalized because of that. But they were less dense, and at some point after the Panic of 1837, a lot of the Southerners do ban banking altogether. So there the trope actually works, but it doesn't work for the earlier period. But yeah, density does matter. And so in New England, you can have a lot more of these small unit banks. They have communities where they have enough people to populate them, but they definitely are. It's still a different way. It doesn't completely explain the differences, and so there's a different approach to why banks and how they should be structured and who is responsible. And in many ways, when we get to the Panic of 1857, the unit banks do horrible, and they're the ones that collapse, and the Southern banks do fine because they're so because of their branching system. And so going into the Civil War, the Southern financial system actually thinks they're better off, and has this really cocky attitude that they're going to be better financed, which we know is absolutely not the case. But it kind of gave them a false sense of security that their banking system was structured better, which it was for some purposes, but not for the Civil War. Thank you.
Thank you. Matt, yes, and then Stephen.
I just want to first say how shocked I am to hear from Sharon that Southerners ever showed any signs of cockiness. But then in relation to, I mean, my paper was mostly about, or my talk was mostly about the state level of this, but there is a regional element that is very much in the shadow of the War of 1812. Because again, of that legacy of federalism, New England style means sectionalism of the most extreme and threatening kind in American life. And so whenever anyone in the 1819 to 1821 debate stood up for the rights of New England or the rights of the North, an available argument for doughfaces was, okay, here we go again. Those you're just like the Federalists trying to break up the Union back during the War of 1812. And that was a very hard legacy to try to escape for anyone who wanted to take an openly pro-New England or even pro-Northern kind of stance. And so there is that regional kind of element that really helped the restrictionists to say we're defending the rights of the North, but the kind of stain of New England style federalism from the war became an available argument against them for the doughfaces. So regionalism really kind of helped both sides and hurt both sides.
Great, thanks. Stephen, yes.
Talking about New England and its relationship to the rest of the United States, I think that probably as late as 1820, New England would have been regarded and would have regarded itself, if there is such a thing as, New England representing everything, about it, that New England was another section and had a certain kind of regional identity. But that by the time of the Civil War, New England had made a largely successful effort to define itself as the basis for national virtue. That is to say, New England, by the time of the Civil War, saw itself, and I think was then seen by a lot of others through its propaganda communication, as a place where republicanism, where democracy could be controlled through a certain kind of orderliness, the New England town, the church steeple, I mean, all of these things which were in fact themselves inventions at the time, that those were models for America. And in fact, New England won that battle because of all the New England names that are around the country. I first thought about this when Nixon was around, and Nixon was born in Whittier, California. And you can find all kinds of Emersons just everywhere. This gets back in a way to kind of the idea of the power of naming, Fort Hood, etc. But it's interesting to me in terms of Maine, is that kind of virtuous landscape was used almost entirely to apply to Connecticut, the land of steady habits, and Massachusetts, the southern New England. And northern New England was sort of thought of as not quite New England. And yet by the early 20th century, it was northern New England that came to represent New England. I'll give you just one example that Robert Frost published, I forget when, before 1920, a book called North of Boston. And north of Boston, and even to this day, you think of what's pure New England, it's Vermont, my own state, my own now adopted state, and it's the northern New England. And southern New England is now regarded as sort of Catholic and industrial. And so New England has migrated itself from south to north. And I find that interesting.
Joe Conforti has a great book on that, Inventing New England. Joe is, of course, a Rhode Islander, now like myself, but who was up in Maine for a good while at the University of Southern Maine. And then Donna Brown has a great book on tourism and New England's marketing of itself, which is another great book for folks to consider if they're interested in these.
Donna Brown is my partner.
And I'm sorry, the title of that book, it's in my office, which is not available to me for the pandemic reasons.
Inventing New England.
Oh, that was Donna Brown, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Donna Brown. I was saying that she lives with me.
Yes.
And we would kind of work together. So her book is Inventing New England.
Inventing New England. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, right. And Conforti's is Becoming New England. That's where I got it wrong. Okay. So both are quality.
We have a kind of clotted relationship about this.
Nice. Excellent. So audience members are encouraged to check that one out. And then, of course, the Maine Historical Society's own Bill Berry had a new book out on Maine a few years back called The Wilder Half of New England, for those interested in this sort of regional approach as well, to expand their collections. So thank you all. So that is actually, we're at the closing time. So just gonna take the opportunity to thank all of our excellent panelists for coming here. It's unfortunate this was the first time that we were not all able to meet face-to-face in Shuttleworth for this talk and the physical reception. I'm so happy that the technology seemed to go off without many hitches, and we had amazing support from the whole staff at MHS, but especially Kathleen Newman running the sort of tech command central post, Jamie Rice for putting this all together. our director, Steve Bromage, for having a steady hand on the tiller, Tilly Lasky for excellent work in terms of some of the curations, which has then gone on to the Maine Memory Network as well. And so for audience members, this will be released in these recordings will be released in podcast forms, so you can make all your friends jealous that share it with them that they missed the live show, but the recording is available. And so as a sort of final closing remarks, thanks to everybody in the audience for making this possible. Especially in this time of reduced state and local budgets, right? Sometimes folks working in the humanities really have to make a case for ourselves. And even though for some of us it's self-evident, I think it's programs like the Historians Forum at MHS and the exhibits when they're available that make these kinds of things, of cases possible. I'm sorry, I just I derailed my own train of thought, despite the absence of trains in 1820. But so it's the shows like, it's presentations like this that facilitate a more informed citizenry for 2020. And so hopefully this series of talks about 1820 and Maine and the nation has made you think a bit differently about the bicentennial of Maine, about who we talk about when we think about we as Mainers and as citizens of the nation and the world at large, and also perhaps made you think differently about our own time and the ways in which 1820 was both far away and not so far away as well. Thanks again all. For those of you who are eager for more content, there's going to be another special Open Historians Workshop on Saturday, August the 1st, open to the public for free. A number of early modern scholars, including myself, are working on a volume on what we're calling the Great Upheaval, the violent period of North American history from 1675 to 1725, Maine's bloodiest half century, but also the half century that gave us Blackbeard the Pirate, the Salem witch trials, the rise in the Atlantic slave trade, the spread of horse culture across North America, and all sorts of massive changes that shaped our world, including Maine in it. And so if you want to see how the historical sausage is made in a very appealing way and talk to scholars as they're collaborating and thinking through some big questions in an accessible manner, definitely come to our website and register for free. Thanks again to everybody. We're glad that you were with us. Be safe, be well, and if you are not yet a member of the Maine Historical Society, you should definitely sign up because it's great to be a part of. Thanks to everybody.